Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. Sorry for the delay, but I am now back in action and I have plenty of episodes lined up after this one. This week I read Street Players by Donald Goines, and that name may sound familiar because I recently read Never Die Alone by him. Now, Street Players is another piece that depicts a few days of a major street player. Released in 1973, this is the fourth novel of Goines, and it's about a prominent pimp conducting business as per usual, which includes recruitment, enforcement, and management. And that is my cleaned up LinkedIn version of what happens in this book. Now, I just want to say again, like I said in my episode for Never Die Alone, the 2022 social standard does not apply to this book. For one, it was written in the 70s, and for two, it's about the streets. So there's a lot of gritty language, as well as just the overall topic. It's not very pleasant. So don't go into this book to try to classify it as problematic, because, we have to be true to the author and the nature of the material. So I just want to put that out there because this book violates every code of political correctness. So now, Donald Goines is an urban fiction pioneer, and in my episode for Never Die Alone, I talked about how without his influence, I don't think we would have a lot of the popular Black-led and Black-produced shows, including Power and BMF and things like that, because he's one of the ones that really opened a lot of people's minds to what a Black writer can accomplish. So he is certainly a legend in his own right. He released about 16 different works between the years of 71 and 74. That was in part due to him being addicted to drugs, and so he was feeding his obsession by writing. And those works include the Kenyatta series. So overall, his books don't really mix together as far as I know. I've only read 2 right now, but there is a specific series of books, the Kenyatta series, and I think it's 4 of them. And he is known for his realistic reflections of street life. So again, we're being true to the material of real life. Also, a not so fun fact, I guess, is that he was actually murdered along with his wife. And it is believed that he was murdered because a lot of what he was writing kind of hit too close to home. So unfortunately, I would have loved to see the writer that he could have evolved into. But his influence is certainly still around. So now, when we talk about street players, what is a street player? Well, by definition, I think it really depends on the hustle. So whoever has some type of hustle, that is obviously illegal. But in this kind of realm of Donald Goines and his work, we're talking about pimping, we're talking about drug dealing, overall strong arming. You could be a bodyguard for someone or like a drug enforcer or something like that. So all types of nasty, illegal jobs. That's what we're talking about. Now, the writing style of this book is different than the first one I read, which was Never Die Alone. The pacing was slightly inconsistent. I was able to kind of keep in touch with the timeline for the first 75% of the book. And that because it's like day-to-day events that are happening at first. And that's because you're meeting a lot of the characters, you're establishing the setting, the background, and the foundation for the plot and the plot and the conflict. So it's easy to understand how much time has passed. But when you get towards the end of the book, it kind of transitions into larger lengths of time in between chapters. So it could be weeks or, we don't really know. Okay, so if you're not a visual audience member, I have changed locations and now my cat is here when I'm recording. So if you hear scratching, that's her. Kitty boo boo. Okay. All right. Back to the review. Now, I will say though that when it comes to the timeline, it's not really important, but I did see of the reviews that I saw that the pacing was a problem for a lot of people, and I think it's mainly because it's inconsistent. It doesn't stay kind of like day to day, not necessarily fast paced, but just easy to follow, like Never Die Alone. So now the tone is very raw and honestly quite repulsive. But when we're talking about the dialogue of pimps in the 70s, like obviously it's going to be repulsive, but that is certainly reflective of the streets. Okay, so the conflict for this book, there's external conflict, of course, but there's also internal conflict with Earl, our main character. It's where the plot kind of revolves around. Oh my gosh. I really hope that this cat does not push my backdrop down. Get down. Stop it. Okay, I'm back. Okay. So, the external conflict is essentially the game. So, these street players, they're playing in the game of life in the streets, all at the same time. And we see this reflection in the friend circle of Earl. And honestly, it's the weirdest circle of friends I've read about because it's centered around competitiveness, but they're also all low-key haters. You can tell that they really don't like each other that much, and I got the vibe that the connections between all of them are volatile in the sense that if something were to go down, they'll probably all flip on each other, or maybe that's the wrong terminology, or kind of sacrifice one of the other ones to save themselves. So it's just this overall tone of deceitfulness amongst the group, the way that they interact and talk to each other, the envy that is clear within them. So it's not really a true friendship. So that's where a lot of the external crisis comes from, as well as obviously the prostitutes that these men are employing, I guess, or overseeing. You know, I don't want to make it sound like it's an actual job, but in order to explain the structure, it's very similar to if a boss had to run like a shop or something, or an office, and dealing with the conflicts between employees, how they interact with each other, and how that ultimately affects the business. That's all very present in this book. And you'll see in just a moment how that plays a role in Earl and his character arc. And then when it comes to internal, I think this really comes from Earl's reflection on his life. So obviously the decisions that he has made up to the point where we meet him has put him in a position of power when it comes to the game of pimping. But also he has to kind of reflect as the book goes by on those decisions, because it puts him down the path of trouble. We're talking about pimping and prostitution. There's no way not to brush up against some type of legal trouble, or just running into enemies, that external thing. And so it started to get to him towards the end, and he had to really deal with the fact that yes, he's responsible for making himself a success in the streets, but he's also responsible for his downfall, ultimately. The inciting event occurs between Earl and Faye, Faye being one of Earl's prostitutes. And this establishes them almost as the protagonist and the villain, because this is the main central problem that we are following and that influences the rest of the book. And this happens maybe halfway through or so. And so this clash of these two characters is what directly leads to the conclusion. Now, we know so much about all of these characters and different relationships because we follow them all via third person. So we know all of their thoughts and their motives and what they're doing when other characters are not in the room, which is great. Now, also, before we get into the characters, this book is very short. All of Donald Goines' books, they're not very long. So there's not a very long explanation when it comes to plot, structure, or character arcs. And that's why we're only going to go over the three main characters here. But these books are, I think they're written intentionally like that. Also, when it comes to those times, I think it wasn't really common to write books very long like it is now. So, yeah, short book, it's going to be a short review. And let's get into it. Okay, so the first main character, I already spoke about him, Earl. His nickname is the Black Pearl. And if there's anything I picked up on, it's that Donald Goines attaches nicknames to his characters, specifically the really important ones, and that's certainly reflective of real life. If you're like a hot shot in whatever field you're in, you probably have a nickname, whether it's sports or I guess in business, you have a nickname because you've accomplished something. And I think that reflects the importance of the character, especially when no one else really has one, or they might have one, it just doesn't matter. Now, Earl the Black Pearl is a pimp, and he is above average, meaning he is kind of like the black excellence of hustling. I put that in parentheses because he covets material wealth. He drives around in nice cars. He has a very nice place where it's mentioned where he lives. It's actually almost exclusively white people that live there. And so that's a sign of status for him in the streets. He's also somewhat classy, even though he's a pimp. He dresses a certain way, always has his hats, his outfits match, and he's in silk and nice shoes and whatnot. And he has a high standard when it comes to pimping, and this really just means that he only wants the best of the best women. This means the women that are going to produce the most money, look the best. Usually it means the younger ones. So yeah, he's presented as a figure that is well respected because he holds that spot of number one at the moment. Now Earl becomes a victim of the game, and this is because he is snitched on by a jaded prostitute, which happens to be Faye. So Faye is a prostitute who worked under Earl for a while. She is disgruntled, to say the least, but she's also very selfish and doesn't really conduct herself well as, I guess, a worker, as an employee. She's not really motivated by much. She just wants to make money and go spend that money on the clubs. And that's from a boss employee situation. That's not, you don't want your employee to just make enough money to go out drinking. They're not making you money that way. Now, her emotional interests are what drives each decision that she makes. So she doesn't really think very clearly about the outcome of her declarations. And also, or I should say lastly, so I talked about how she's not a good prostitute because she only wants to earn money to dance, and this means there is a cap on her ambition. And Earl the Black Pearl, someone who sees himself as above the rest, he doesn't really respect stuff like that around him, because how is he going to maintain his position on the top if he's surrounded by lazy people? So now Vicky is the new prostitute, and I just want to say that this was the worst part for me, was reading the chapters that involved Vicky, because she is young. I think she's 17 in the books. She's about to turn 18 or whatever. But through her, we're able to see how Earl picks up these women and coerces them into being a prostitute and sticking by him for years until, of course, he's done with them. And so already we see the differences between Vicky and Faye. You know, one's been here for long and, you know, they're not really about it. But then we have Vicky, who is, it's not necessarily ambition that she has. She's just very ignorant. She just doesn't know. She's young. And that is something that someone like Earl can pick up on and mold these girls into being something that they want them to be. So in that, I would say that Vicky is certainly a reflection of the audience's ignorance, because, I mean, I don't know nothing about prostituting and any of that. And so seeing her journey from being this innocent girl, you know, hanging out with her friends, to towards the end of the book, she meets a very bad ending. It's really disheartening. And she also affected Earl because she transformed Earl as a character. So Earl's character arc really ends with the destruction of his mental state because he lost Vicky. And so what we find is he essentially fell in love with Vicky, and that's kind of a no-no. You don't fall in love with your prostitutes, you know, they're just your workers and that's it. But he found himself wanting to give her more and do more for her, and just having a very special place in his heart for her, while still prostituting her out, mind you. But when Vicky, spoiler alert, when Vicky gets murdered, that's the end of Earl. And so that's where we see him come down from this arrogance, this confidence of knowing who he is, and he lets his guard down. And that's how he meets his fate. So those three characters are the primary, I would say, within this book. Something about Goines is that he does incorporate a lot of different characters within such a short amount of time, which is really applaudable. Is that a word? I don't know. It's good because he doesn't include too much information on those that don't really matter. And sometimes there are different side characters that just show up with no purpose, but that's kind of life. So you'll hear about, you know, what's his name down the street, who did such and such, and that's it. So yeah, those were just the main ones that were the most important to the plot. But because this book is so short, the plot is it's not as in-depth as others. Now, review time. We're already here. So I will say that, first of all, the synopsis on the back of the book is terrible, and it's not reflective of the actual plot. The synopsis essentially is talking about like there's some underlying backstabbing going on within the friend group, and there's this unknown antagonist that's hiding in the shadows that is plotting on Earl's downfall. Is that kind of right? Kind of, but even that doesn't really happen until like the last 10, 20 pages of the book. So it's not really reflective. I would just say that this book revolves around prostitution in the 70s, and that's it. Leave it at that. So, yeah, it was a short read. I will not be rereading this one. I think this one in particular, the content was just too gritty for me. And again, I think it goes back to reading about Vicky and just seeing how basically she got turned out. It made me feel kind of like really gross. So, but again, that's spoken from someone who was raised in the suburbs. So I'm not used to any of this stuff, but you know, I enjoyed Never Die Alone. So I don't know. I just didn't really like this one. It wasn't enough in it for me to want to reread or revisit it. So good book though, at the end of the day. Now, the only takeaway I have from this is that you can change your position in the game and you can make it to the top, but you'll never win. Because honestly, each W, it's associated with another expiration date. So we saw Earl at the top of the game, and we also saw how it came crashing down. So you can get that top spot, but you'll only have it for so long. And I think that might have been my takeaway for Never Die Alone as well. The streets don't love you, so keep that in mind. If you're playing in the streets, you probably should have some sort of exit strategy. And even that doesn't always really work out for people as far as we know. So I don't know. Stay safe. Stay out of the streets. And that's all. Next week, I am reviewing the Articles of Confederation. So that's on the plate. And then this pile over here to my left has a lot of the books that I'm currently reading. So there's a lot of theater pieces in here. A Raisin in the Sun I'm revisiting right now. Where's my other... There's another play I'm reading. I think it's The Importance of Being Earnest. Yeah, The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. I'm reading that as well. So there's going to be a good amount of theater reads coming up next. Of course, I have some Shakespeare and things like that. And then also, you know, some just regular books. So yeah, stay tuned. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode, and I look forward to seeing everyone next week. Have a good weekend.